Conferences where I made a comment about you being like a hobbit, because like the last speaker has a mic like this, and I was trying to get it down to my level and got some real stick, and I was like, look, I'm not a hobbit, and they're like, well, look at those hands, you have to be.
Let's see your feet.
And then somebody said, how much hair's on your feet? So, I'm going to talk to you today about application of NMR spectroscopy, and I know this is kind of a high-end technique, and it's the machine in the chemistry department that they like to make all the students afraid of, because they don't want to deal with something going wrong when people put a sample in it. It's an expensive piece of equipment, but there's lots of people like me around that I actually buy NMR machines on eBay and then keep them as, I know how to make them work. And so I've been applying it in the beverage analysis a little bit myself as like a hobby, because I get to drink all the samples that I look at. So, I mean, some of the competing technologies, I don't know much about the Foss wine screener, which is like one technique that you could use, one analysis that you could use as an infrared technology. But it's very correlative. They have to do other tests and then correlate the results of the infrared to those other tests to then give you the numbers that you get out of that machine. There are other techniques like GC that is very good for volatiles, for example, so the olfactory things, the sensory things, that's what that analyzer is good for. And then also HPLC, liquid chromatography, is good for organic acids, sugars, things like that. But what you tend to have to do is send off for a test of some group of components of your cider. You don't just get a test that like sees everything. You have to pay $200 for the sugars, $200 for the organic acids. Whereas what I do is you see everything all at once, there's no sample preparation or anything, you just put the sample in an NMR tube, shake it off and run it. And the machines tend to be very expensive, and but like I said, you can get away with running it for like next to nothing if you know what you're doing. They have superconducting magnets, so magnetic resonance imagers are like a technology that offshooted from the NMR technology, and it's used by chemists to try and figure out what chemical structures they have. If they're trying to make a particular molecule, they can prove that they made it with the results from this machine. And one big thing that people are doing is, this is like a little cartoon that I stole, like a guy is trying to figure out, if I have a population of people, can I figure out who's obese, who has diabetes? So you collect, you know, you have them eat things, you know, and then you either look at blood plasma or fecal matter, which is probably not a fun one to do, or urine, and you can look at the metabolites of the human being and figure out, you do the NMR analysis, you get your results for all the different groups, and then you do like a pattern recognition mathematical thing to it. And you can figure out, okay, this population has obesity, this population doesn't. And this metabolite aspect of it is very similar to what you're looking at in a beer or a cider or a wine. You're looking at the metabolites of the yeast. So you get this kind of complex spectrum that has ethanol and all these other things in it. And you can see all the other little molecules that the yeast produced as well. And so stay with me with some of the NMR stuff, because it can be like kind of complicated, but at the end of the day, it's an absolute technique, which is like one of its real advantages in that the peaks for ethanol are always in the same place on this scale. And they always have a certain look to them, because what you're looking at is the hydrogens in the molecule. So you're looking at either the CH3, the CH2, or the OH of the ethanol. And so this is the CH3 peak. It's always going to be down in this kind of region of the spectrum. CH3s from all kinds of molecules are down in this region of the spectrum. And what happens is, when this CH3 is sat next to this CH2, the hydrogens on this guy, they're like, a proton is like a little planet, right? You imagine a proton of an atom. It has spin, it's spinning like a planet. So when you have a charged particle, a proton, spinning, it generates a magnetic field. And so what we're doing in this spectroscopy is manipulating those magnetic fields. They spin at a rate that's like a radio frequency. So they're going at like 200 megahertz, 40 megahertz, like FM radio kind of frequency ranges. So you hit them with radio pulses, and you can get signals back that you can then interpret. This is where people always fall asleep, and so it's not worth going into it, to be honest. But what I wanted to show you is that when these protons here are right next to these protons on this CH2, And the way that each one of these protons can see these CH2s is they can see either both of those two guys over there are pointing up, if you imagine spins in a magnet kind of pointing with the magnet. Two of them are up, or one's down and one's up, or one's up and one's down, or they're both down. Those are the combinations, right? So this is why this signal is split into 1 to 2 to 1 peaks. It's a triplet. And then over here you have CH2s. It sees the CH3s over there. And they can all be up, and then there's different combinations, and you can have, 1 to 3 to 3 to 1 is the ratio of these peaks. So inherent in the spectrum is like an information about what's next to the protons on my molecule, and it becomes very, very specific for every molecule. And so what you can do is you can go into all the molecules you might find in cider, and you can find protons that are in unique parts of that spectrum and have specific doublets or triplets or singlets depending on the protons that are next to them in the molecules. And you have this kind of fingerprint of that molecule in the cider. And then you have, 200 of those guys in a cider, or probably thousands and thousands. And they're all kind of there quantitatively showing up in the spectrum. You're going to get a big spectrum from a big peak from something that's there a lot, and a very small peak from something that's there hardly any at all. And so this is spectra of things that you might find in the metabolome of a yeast, right? So you've got like succinic acid is comes out of the yeast while it's going through fermentation. Ethyl acetate is when the ethanol reacts with the acetic acid that you produced. Methanol is like a baddie, it kills people in Russia when it's in the vodka. They're not very careful about the cuts there. Malic acid has like a multiplet structure here and 4 peaks over here. Isobutanol are like the fusel alcohols. There's usually citric floating around, and if you have fruit additions, you can see it in the spectrum. You see this kind of 4-peak looking. And what I want to emphasize is these don't move around. They're always in the same place in the spectrum. So you can go hunting for these things and quantify them. Acetic acid shows up here as a singlet because the CH3 is next to a carboxyl group that this carbon here doesn't have a hydrogen on it. So it's not going to get split. It's not going to interact with the hydrogen on the next molecule. Acetaldehyde, unfortunately, reacts with water. So you think that it's like one kind of molecule, but when you put it in water, it reacts with the water and polymerizes on itself, and it ends up being a big mess. So you get all kinds of oligomers, which are polymers of acetaldehyde when you put that in water. And propanol is here. You have propanol has this CH3 is this triplet. Then this guy here has 2 protons on this guy and 3 protons on this guy, and it's like an n+1 rule. So there's 5 protons either side, so it's going to split into 6 peaks. And if you count the peaks here, there's like 6 little peaks there. So that's all the NMR science that I think we're going to do today. The other important thing about NMR, and this is all kind of I just got back from Japan, so I'm a bit of a zombie right now. There's a meeting to try and get this technology okayed by the ISO committees, which are like the International Standards Organization, to have it as a method for quantifying the purity of drugs. And that's mainly where this technology is used, is in the pharmaceutical industry. So if you look at a cider, what do you see? When you first look at it, you've got this is an internal. What I wanted to say about this actually is you can buy standards from chemical company like Sigma Aldrich, and they'll give you an ultra pure internal standard, and you buy one. I usually use maleic acid, which is this guy. It has 2 hydrogens that are identical to each other on this molecule, and they show up at like 6.4 ppm, always in the same place, and it's kind of out of the way of all the chemistry of what I'm interested in, like all the sugars and the organic acids and things like that. So you use that because it's not going to interfere, but it's nice and easy. So basically I'm going to put some of that material in at a known weight, like 10 milligrams, and I know there's 2 hydrogens on it. I'll get into this in a minute. So when you look at cider, it looks really boring. I've got water peak, I've got my internal standard that I threw in there, and then there's 2 little ethanol peaks down here. On the OH of the ethanol, that hydrogen on the OH is exchangeable. So it sees the water and it says, okay, well, let's swap hydrogens. You take mine, I'll take yours. And so the OH ends up in the same peak as the water. So there is a way that we can actually irradiate at exactly this frequency with the radio waves and kill that water peak. So the water molecules are going nuts. So that when you do a pulse to look at the spectrum, the water molecules are all over the place. They don't have a coherent signal that will give you a good signal. So they give you a weird looking signal that looks like that. And part of the problem is, if you're really interested in the sugars, like this is a beer, and this is all the leftover malt that was in the beer, this distortion kind of screws up what you can see in here. So what I do is I'll, a lot of times, run a sample straight, but then I'll freeze dry the sample. So I quantify all the volatiles, like ethanol and acetic acid and methanol and things like that, if they're in there, on the as-is sample. And then what I'll do is I'll freeze dry the sample. They're all going to pop out, but everything that was not volatile, like leftover sugars, are still there. And then what you do is you redissolve that sample in D2O, which is heavy water, which is what the heroes of Telemark blew up in Norway. It's like, you know, making heavy water for making the atomic bomb. That stuff is like $1 for a milliliter now. It's like dirt cheap, and they make it by distillation, I think. And so you put the sample back into D2O. Deuterium doesn't show up when you're looking at the hydrogens, but it's exactly the same chemistry of water, so it doesn't do anything to the sample that's weird. So this kind of distortional thing, when you're trying to see all this low-lying stuff, because what I wanted to show is that when you kill that water peak, you start to be able to see all the interesting stuff in it. There's the ethanol that the TTB want to know about, but then there's all the other stuff in here is all the good stuff. And so what we do is, this is our internal standard. I know there's a hydrogen here and a hydrogen here, so there's two of them. So I can say, okay, the area under this peak is equal to 100. And so one hydrogen on that molecule is equal to 50. And then I go over to my ethanol peak, and I know this is the CH3, so there's 3 hydrogens in this peak, and it comes to 367, so I divide that by 3. So then I have the molar ratio of my internal standard to the ethanol. I know the weight of this that I put in, I know the weight or volume of the beer I'm looking at, I know the molecular weight of ethanol, I know the molecular weight of this, and from that there's this equation you can calculate what the actual weight per liter or whatever it is. So, you know, depending on what volume you're looking at, you can figure it all out. So then, if you look at all the good stuff that's in a cider, the kind of things you can see, and these are blow-ups of the area down here. So I'm seeing everything at once, and when you look at this, a lot of people look at this and they think it's like a chromatogram, which is that GC and HPLC data that you were looking at. So in that, every peak is a different molecule. In this, every molecule can give you peaks at different places. So a lot of times you might say, well, is that really that molecule? And you can go look for the other parts of the molecule. And so is this really ethanol? I can go over here and say, okay, I can see the 4 peaks of the other part of the ethanol here and confirm it's there. And the other difference is, this is an absolute thing. This never changes. So if you're doing HPLC, you have to buy standards and calibrate the columns and make sure that the peak coming out at 2.5 minutes is that molecule. And then every molecule that you look at has a different response factor to the detector. So depending on the chemistry of the molecule, the size of the signal you get at the detector changes depending on, and so you have to take all that into account, and so you have to know everything about every molecule, and it's a pain in the butt. Whereas this is just really straightforward. So like if you zoom in here, forget this guy, this is part of the signal kind of in the baseline. But these are the fusel alcohols. So this is isobutanol and isopentanol. So those are going to be of interest later if you're going to make Applejack or something like that, probably. And then you've got lactic acid here, and you've got malic acid over here. So in this sample of Magnus, there has been some malolactic fermentation going on. So you can actually kind of see what's going on. Where are you in that process? Did it go all the way? Did you stop it at some point? What happened? You have quinic acid here, which is part of the apple juice. Guess it's kind of like a tannin because a lot of times it's attached to aromatics that are part of the polyphenol part of it. So you see this kind of thing in cranberries. There's a lot in cranberry, and I think it's what makes it kind of make pucker a little bit. This peak going out of here is acetic acid. You have succinic acid, which is another molecule that's part of that glucose to ethanol process. And you have, down in here, you've got, there's a couple of peaks that are from fructose. There's some peaks here that are from glucose. This peak is from sucrose. And you can see polyphenols and things like that, but you see them as like a lump. And there's no discernment of what kind of polyphenols are there. And so I haven't done enough work to try and figure any of that stuff out. So I'm not going to talk about any of that today. But there is some things we could figure out if I could work with somebody who has mass spec. The same way it would be kind of cool. And so this is how I get the equation that I use to get for each of the components that I can see in that spectrum. If I'm using 175 microliters, this is how I figure out how many milligrams per liter, which is really easy to figure out how many grams per liter and things like that. So I won't go into that too much. Everything is always linear. So this is ethanol from 0.1%, so like kombucha level, up to hard liquor. And it's totally linear across the whole range. So you can see stuff down in like the hundredths of a percent range all the way up to like 45% in Applejack or something like that. And one of the reasons I started thinking about beverages is the company that makes there's two companies that make the equipment. And these guys are in Germany. They've been working for years with all the Appalachian Control A in France, some of the bodies in Germany and in Czech and in Hungary to like build databases of the wines. And the issue is beer and cider don't have the cachet yet, but I mean, sometimes you're buying $30, $40, $50 bottles of sour beer or nice fancy ciders. So I mean, there's some money there. But you know, in wine, they're always worried about the label. So this technology is used to kind of have the fingerprints of everybody's vintage. So they can tell you the label, the vintage, is it from that part of France? And then what they do is they give you all this information, and then they give you these printouts with all the chemistry, and then say this was a Riesling. They have a database of all the results of all the Rieslings in the database, thousands of them, and it tells you where your chemistry lies in the distribution. I don't know what you do with that, but you know, some people probably do. I mean, you know. And so this has always been my problem. Is like I'm so happy that the room is full. I thank you guys for coming. I thought there'd be like 2 people here. Like it seems like massive overkill, but you get a lot of information out of this thing, and you can get it relatively cheaply. And at the end of the day, you get all this detailed information that you just add up and you spit out a nutrition label. So if you charge somebody $200 to get all this information, you can also turn around and say, I'll give you a nutrition label as well, batch by batch if you want. Because it's just right there. All you do in an Excel spreadsheet is add it all up. And I think it's like $800 for a nutrition label per sample, I think. And all it tells you is nitrogen and like really simplistic things. It doesn't tell you very much. So where can you use NMR in the process? You can use it anywhere. I mean, as long as you can get a sample, you're going to look at whatever is in the water solution. So you can look at the apple juice that you're pressing. You can look at it at any stage in the fermentation process. So I've got an example of something I just did with William Grote, who's like a very serious hobbyist right now, but we did a nice little project together. So this is what apple juice is. I want you guys all to leave. You'll actually know how to read NMR spectrum when you leave. You'll be like, oh. So again, like I said, it's always in the same place. So when you look at an apple juice, you always see sucrose, glucose. In here, these 3 groups of peaks here are fructose. All the rest of this is glucose, fructose, and sucrose, but we use certain peaks in here to quantify it. This peak's your malic acid. This juice was from a Fuji apple that we left over the weekend, and we kind of pressed the juice and just let it sit there, and so malolactic took off, and it completely lost all its malic and went to lactic, and it made some ethanol, and it made 2,3. There's a lot of a lot of bacterial stuff going on with that one. But this is crab apples, and you'll see like the ratios. And then I went to Cider Days, which Ria is really big on. And there's Second Chance Orchard. I don't know if anybody's been to that cider meeting. They're there with like, I think 65 different apple varieties on the table. From all like heirloom varieties. You can go taste them, really delicious. So I like bought, that sounded kind of weird, but I said, give me some, I'm going to buy 1 apple of each one. And I kind of pressed the juice out of it and got all the sugar numbers and the malic numbers, but I didn't do much beyond that. But, you know, it looks like they're all the same, but they're really not. I mean, sometimes there's as much sucrose as glucose, and I mean, they're all over the place with sugar content and malic content. And malic, you know, really goes with the bitter, I guess. So you can look at the juices, and then you can look at, you know, the chemistry is the same if you're looking at juices. And Maria, who does the Cider chat, she's got quince, who's one of the fruits that talks on the show. So I actually think on here I actually have the juice from a quince. No sucrose in that one, but it's got glucose and fructose. And so as an example, this is what the spectrum of pure fructose looks like, pure glucose, pure sucrose, glycerol, which is made in the fermentation process too, and then here's ethanol. And so like it looks really busy in here, but you'll notice that on this scale, they all have like individual areas where there's only that peak. So what we do is I actually use this like doublet peak here, and I can figure out from the pure spectrum how many hydrogens it represents. It's this hydrogen on fructose. And then glucose has 2 peaks because there are 2 conformations of glucose in solution. There's one where the OH is down and one where it's axial. So this is equatorial and this is axial. I get in chemistry class now. And this is axial. So there's 2 different, and they're usually about a 2-to-1 ratio in water. And then sucrose is down here. It's out on the side. So when you superimpose those spectra, you see this guy's all by itself, so I can use that to quantify the fructose. I can use this peak to quantify the glucose, and this one the sucrose. And so what we did with William was he made up 3 identical apple juice starters. And he depleted the nutrients in one, he kept one as his control, and he bought Scott Labs All Firm nutrient feed and stuck it in the other one. And he wanted to see what would be the difference in the ciders at the end. So this is the 3 ciders as we started off. They're identical, right? So the malic acid and the sugars, they're all pretty much identical. But when you zoomed in into the baseline, we could actually pick out the nutrients that the Scott Labs nutrients had added in, all the different amino acids that are in there. Down here, you can't. I couldn't really tell the difference between the nutrient depleted. So when he said he got the nitrogen out of there, I think he just precipitated all the protein. It wasn't really like freely available amino acids. So to me, these 2 kind of look the same. I can't really see the protein, but I can see the free amino acids that the yeast would use. And so when we zoomed into different areas of the spectrum, we could actually see that, you know, we could de-replicate what was in the Scott Labs product. Like they've got tyrosine. This is the O-firm. It had tyrosine in it. You see these 2 peaks here are up here. Has tryptophan in it, and then it has phenylalanine in it, and I think it has histidine, which is part of this peak here. And then we went into the other part. The reason I'm showing this is some people are really interested in, and we totally missed it in the project, because the next sample he sent me was a week down the road. And the yeasty beasties had already grabbed all this and made cell walls with it, or whatever they're doing. And so we didn't see. But if you're really interested in the first couple of days, what are the yeast eating, and what does that mean further down the road? You could like do a spectrum every 3 hours or something and see what's disappearing first. You know, do they have a preference on what they like to eat first? So this was like the nutrient depleted sample. So this is this is from the beginning of November to the 5th of January, and you can see that. As time went by, and this is a plot of what happened to the fructose, the glucose, and the sucrose. And you'll see that the amount actually went up because the sucrose is actually glucose and the fructose stuck together. And the yeast inverts it and splits them apart into glucose, because it doesn't actually eat the sucrose, it eats the glucose and the fructose. So the glucose content actually goes up because initially you have the yeast aren't eating the sugars, but the invertase that's in the system is inverting the sugar and it's showing up in solution as glucose instead of. So we actually caught that happening. And nothing happened to the mallet the whole time, as an example. But we actually watched these trajectories, and if you look like this, there's a long trajectory here. Glucose always goes first, and there's fructose always hangs on. And if you get too high of a differential between the glucose content and the ratio of the 2, that's when you have like a hung fermentation. It's not going to keep progressing very quickly. This was his control, and it kind of looks the same. And then this was the one with the nutrients, and it doesn't have that long tail to the fructose. After 20 days, everything was done. And he's giving, I think he's got the flu, so he sent a friend of his down that's going to give the talk instead. And they did sensory with this, and there was a difference between this last one and the other two. And they went into all the details. He's bought like some Bluetooth technologies, he's watching density happening. And when you plot the densities against what's happening with the sugars, it's kind of all the same. You're actually, you know, with the, this is the problem. You really need to know what happens to the sugars when you have the specific gravity. It's telling you that as well. So, but where this comes in is you don't have a clue what's going on with malic or anything like that. So this is, if you plot the three of them compared to each other, and you can see the one with nutrients went gangbusters. It went really well. And then when you looked at the ethanol content, it spiked. And then some of this other dilution of that is that he was then racking it and putting in fresh juice and things like that. So the ethanol content dropped because he diluted it with fresh juice. So you can watch the ethanol content, and they all ended up at about 6.5. But we were looking at the three ciders at the end of the day. The third one tasted really different. And I think he's going to have 3 jugs, so you can taste it for yourself. You know, we were looking at what happened. So cider number 3 started off gangbusters, like it was like doing a really good job. But what seems to have happened is that the you know, the yeast grew quickly and finished, and then dropped out. And then that had impact later on when it came to all the fresh juice he was throwing in. There wasn't as much around to actually do a good job of converting that as well. And so he ended up with more sugar in number 3 when you would have expected it to not be quite like that because it had all the nutrients. So they're going to go into a lot of detail about that, so I'm not going to really try and spoil the parade there. Then I was going to just show you some, like this is a mead, so we're looking at meads. And I was going to talk a little bit about Spanish cider. I don't know if anybody's into Spanish cider here, but they're really different than everything else. And so if you have, like, this is a New York farmhouse barrel aged, you'll see that this one has a tiny bit of malolactic, of malic left, and a ton of lactic. So different people's ciders just have completely different distributions of all these chemicals in there, and that's why it's like a fingerprint. And I don't know in the world of terroir and all these things that people are trying to embrace. It's a really difficult thing to embrace, and you're going to have to do, you know, just your yeast can affect what these distributions are like. You know, infections can affect. So how you make the chemistry of the metabolites of your yeast be your terroir, I'm not sure. When you're dealing with mead and honey containing things, the honey itself is very much a terroir thing, and because the non-fermentable sugars in there are all really different from the type of bees, the type of flora they were playing around in, the region of the world you're in. So there's a terroir there. So if you're putting honey in your wine, there's something you can do, but I don't know how you do that. The other things you could bring in is like elemental analysis of your water, because that's like a whole other thing that's particular to your place where you're making your cider. So if you have that like a metals analysis of what's in there, that might be something you add to a chemical analysis. But you can see like back sweetened, so this is like an Angry Orchard where they've added sugars back in at the end. This is one that's made by a guy in Poughkeepsie where I'm from in New York, and it's dry as a bone. There's, all the malic has gone to lactic. And what you can see here is glycerol. And so in most regular ciders, there's a lot of glycerol before it's made, right? If you have Spanish ciders or wild fermentations, all of a sudden it doesn't look like this. So I put this up to just show that this is what glycerol looks like. So if you look at like different Spanish ciders, and then this one was an American Cider that was made, they have a ton of stuff that you just don't see in the regular, in like over here, like, so at 1.7 there's nothing, right? You go to this guy, and I looked at the Spanish set, and you see this huge, and it's big, I mean there's a lot of it there. And then when you go over and look next to the ethanol peak here, those 4 peaks that were from the glycerol, they're really tiny in this one, you can just about see them. They're not present at all in this one. And so what's happening is the yeasty beasties are eating all the sugars, and you still leave them anaerobic, and they start looking around for something else to do. So they see all the glycerol and they start eating that, and they try and convert that to ethanol. And when they do, they make this 1,3-propylene glycol, which is actually patented by Kraft as a flavor enhancer. So it's like MSG. And then you make propionic acid. So you make a lot of 3-carbon molecules. You make a lot of 1-propanol as well. And so when you go back to the Cidra, there's like a triplet in here which would have lined up with that 1-propanol spectrum I showed you right at the beginning. And so you can quantify the 1-propanol. This quartet here is from the propionic acid. And then there's this triplet here to the side of the ethanol is the other part of that molecule. So you can kind of prove that that's really what it is. You've got ethyl acetate going on here and a lot of ethyl lactate. Ethyl acetate, there's a lot of acetic acid. So they're really, really different ciders than just regular. What that means, I don't know. You guys have to interpret that. You guys think about this stuff all day. So, I guess some people like Spanish cider, some people don't. And this is kind of proving, the completely different chemistry in your mouth. There's no glycerol, so it's not going to have a lot of mouthfeel. So, and there's talk about a dryness scale that's going to be talked about. Is something like this kind of analysis where you can see the sugars and you can see the glycerol content. So glycerol's thick, right, and it sits on your tongue. Is something like this kind of analysis something that you could use in parallel with sensory and understand what the dryness is that's in your mouth? And then this is, if you wanted to throw in maple syrup, for example. So maple syrup, there's a lot of sucrose, a tiny bit of glucose, no fructose. If you look at honey, there's glucose and fructose. There's literally no sucrose. So they actually use this in Europe to prove that people are putting like invert syrup into honey at like 20-30% and getting an economic boost from that and selling you cheap stuff at honey price. When you zoom into this area here, you'll see there's all these little peaks in here, and these are all these weird sugars and disaccharides that the yeast can't process. So they stay there. That's probably a lot of the residual sweetness in that if you had a really dry mead or a really dry cider or something like that. So this is a cider. This is a cider right here, and you can see that the finished cider has this complex chemistry in here. All the glucose is gone. There's a lot of fructose. It always seems to get left behind. So I know ciders and meads are kind of really tricky to study. So this might be a way of studying what's going on. And you can see that if you took a honey and you take what's left here, what's left in the honey, this is the honey with glucose going out the roof, but this is what's left in that cider. All this lines up, but like how much of each of these peaks is in there really varies with wildflower versus clover versus what kind of bee. And this is like, so for things like this, you really can do like a terroir from it and say, it's from this kind of stuff. If anybody has any questions, always just...
Is that true also for maple syrup, that because it's coming from the same trees, it has that same fingerprint?
Yeah, but they're not quite as different from each other. I've found. I've looked at some, but not a ton. But they seem to be really similar to each other. Not as much variability as in honey. And then this is like a practical example. There was a company that contacted me because they had exploding cans. They were like, we don't know why the cans are exploding. So we kind of looked at them and we got a really obvious answer that like there was more ethanol in that can. It's kind of a no-brainer, right? That something that had carried on fermenting, there was less sugar in it because it had fermented and gone to ethanol. But we were like, we don't really know why. And there was there wasn't something had happened. That was all we could figure out. But then they did a second batch, and when we ran the second batch, so these were supposed to be the same ciders, but a different batch. And you'll see that in this one, there's no lactic acid here. There's two peaks here. So in one they got malolactic fermentation going on, and then the other they didn't. So they had something going on there. And then when you looked at the second batch, these two peaks right here are sorbate. And there was half the amount of sorbate in this batch as there was in the other batch. So running the other batch, actually, maybe this was the problem why the fermentation carried down, dosed it enough with the sorbate. So, you know, you can take all your commercial ciders, you can get your sugar contents, you can look at all the small organic acids, the lactic versus the malic. You guys have to decide what you do with it. Then I was going to kind of like try and entertain you a little bit. So what happens in beer? This is what beer looks like. Everything's in the same place. The only big difference is like instead of sugars, you've got malt. Malt has a lot of polymers of glucose in it. And whenever you have like a branch in a glucose, so it's all like a chain, and then there's branches where you then get other chains hanging off. Wherever there's a corner, the amylase can't deal with the corner, so it kind of chomps along like Pac-Man until it gets to a corner, and then we're like, well, I can't fit around that. So then it just leaves that behind. So you have all these branches, and they are very particular to the kind of malt that you're using and what kind of bugs you have in there. So Brettanomyces Saccharomyces won't eat those corners that the amylase left behind, but Brettanomyces will. And so you can see big differences in what's going on. And in sour beers, there's this 1,3-propanediol, so that glycerol conversion that was going on in the Spanish ciders goes on in sour beer as well. And that might be a place where cider and beer kind of merge, is like, you know, that whole area. I don't think you're going to be doing pilsners and cider, but I think, you know, sour beer and cider would be like a kind of a cool product, I think. So this is, if you look at, sorry, we've looked at lots of malt, like in the wort phase, and then watch what happened with it. It was all really boring. We found some really interesting stuff on all these New England IPAs where they do some weird, they do something weird to the malt. The guy told me, and it went straight by me. I'm not like a brewer. But they do something there, and they end up with a whole, like a different distribution of sugars and glucans in solution. They don't completely solubilize all the proteins. And I'm not an IPA guy, so I was like, and I didn't even drink those samples. They sent me, it was a really high-end place, and they sent me all these beers, and they like analyzed these, and I was like, it's really good. I was like, people line up for this? But when you look at this, you'll see that there's some that have, this is actually maltose, so this is where you would end up with yeasty munchable sugars. And then all this stuff down here is glucoses that are near a branching point, and these guys are actually the branching point. So when you look at things like Brettanomyces beers, they always have very different distributions of all this stuff. And then I'll keep going. So we do the ethanol. So this is a comparison of what was on the can and what the NMR said. They were pretty close. I mean, they were within like that 0.5% that the TTB gives you. And then, these are all the organic acids. There's a lot more amino acids in beer, just because the malt's full of it. And then this is, and then at the end of the day, we added everything up and figured out the calories per 12-ounce can. And then an engineer said, you can't just randomly show all the beers. You have to like stack them so that you can say, oh yeah, I'm still light. That is at the light end, and North Coast Old Rasputin, which is delicious, is down at this end. But it's like, this is why I'm a fatty, right? And then we've been looking at kombucha a little bit. We got involved with some things about kombucha. So this is, again, if you look at kombucha, there's not supposed to be much ethanol in it, but there usually is. So you've got ethanol, acetic acid is quite vinegary. There's hardly any lactic, so this whole idea that it's good for your gut, it's not full of lactobacillus, it's full of acetobacters, and I don't think that's probiotic, is it? So that's all bull. And then you've got citric acid in here, and you've got some sugars that make it taste good. But if you've got sugars and live SCOBY, you're in for trouble, right? I mean, it's silly that. So they were all like 1.35. There was one that was less than 0.5%, and they were consistently lower. So you definitely, if you're making kombucha, you definitely want to be in a brewery and saying there's alcohol in it, because there's always going to be. And I mean, this all came down because some woman bought kombucha and had bottles of it where she does a washing up, and they became bottle bombs. They exploded, shattered glass in the eye. She lost an eye, and so she was suing some of the manufacturers. And then 2% alcohol. And then I went into a grocery store in Connecticut, and they had like a tap, and you buy the glass and then fill it, and you can go back, and the kombucha's just sitting there. So I took this one, and it was like 3%. So it's like pregnant women are like, oh, I love kombucha, it's awesome. Yeah, so it's like, you've got to be careful. And then if you want to look at, like this is all different. So now you guys can all read this, right? This is sucrose. Sucrose on the far left, glucose is this one, there's fructose in here. So this is your Smirnoff vodka. If you zoom in, these are the fusel alcohols here. So if you go up to vodka, there aren't any. So things like Cointreau, the quality of the booze that's in there, there's no fusels in there. So they must be using like vodka-like liquor in Cointreau. Drambuie should be whiskey, so it has like these are. This is probably acetaldehyde or acetone right here. If you have Bailey's Irish cream, these fat lumps are the fat in the cream. So you could quantify that if you wanted to. I think this is probably a preservative. It's citrate, so it's probably in there as a preservative. Yep.
So if you've aged in a used bourbon barrel, would you pick up those shadows?
Yeah, those I maybe. Yeah, I don't know how you tell the difference between what came out of the barrel and what came out of the cider. It's all the same molecules, right?
Right, but so there's no specific fingerprint in like formulation.
You would have to go and look at like what came out of the barrel, so the tannins and things like that. And so I don't have a fancy enough freeze dryer to freeze dry the alcohol out. I've got a cold trap in it that is at like -64. So it's not cold enough to trap the ethanol, and that would go through into the pump and ruin the oil, and then you'd ruin your pump. So you've got to buy a special unit that can catch the ethanol. But if you could freeze dry that, you'd then be looking at another region of the spectrum that's out here where all the polyphenols are and things like that. And you might see a lot of character there, I think. A lot of mass spec people are doing that, I think. But it's not, mass spec is not quantitative really. And when you do it quantitatively, it costs a fortune. And the trouble with mass spec and HPLC is because you have to like cherry pick what things you're looking at in the sample, you can just completely miss like something big in your sample that went wrong, or you can get very blinkered and think everything's fine and something isn't. That's why the drug industry are really interested in it, because you see everything. And so if you've got something like, it's supposed to be a pure drug, but there's something in there that doesn't have a ultraviolet chromophore that the detector from the HPLC can see, you can have things in there that could be there. I watched a guy from Europe, there was something in there, 50%, and the HPLC didn't even see it. So they thought the purity was 99%, and it was like 48. And then you could look at vinegars, like another thing. The TTB are interested in this because it's got a lot of volatile acid, and it really throws off that near-infrared analyzer. So you can look at, there's a lot of sugar in vinegars, or not. Like this is a Napa Valley vinegar company, so I'm not even sure what that is. There's a ton of stuff in here, I don't know what it is. So when you really go into the baseline, there's lots of molecules in there that look really interesting, but I don't know what they are. So I'm trying to find somebody who can work with me from like a mass spec side and tell me, I saw all this stuff in there, and I'll look at it and say, okay, I can see that, and that, and there's some of that might be it, and then I can figure it out. So I just got back from Tokyo where there was a summit, so they're trying to make this legal. I went down and gave a talk to the TTB about it. The TTB don't care how you analyze your stuff as long as it's validated, and that when they test it, you're going to get the same number, right? And they're interested in buying, they might be buying one of those brokers last time I talked to them. But you can go to a TTB certified lab, but all that means is that they're qualified to certify liquor that's been exported. It doesn't actually mean anything with respect to cider. So that was the other thing I found out. So I was like, do I have to become TTB certified? And they were like, well, do you certify liquor being exported? I'm like, no. So they were like, why would you do that? because they're going to send me a whiskey sample. It's got nothing to do with cider and beer. And that is it. I'd like to thank William Grote and his team of people. They're going to be giving the talk tomorrow at 3:30. And I'll take any questions if you still have any.